Welcome everyone. My name is David Wood and I chair London Futurists. Our speaker today is Susan Snyder, PhD, who is the William F. Dietrich Distinguished Professor of Philosophy of Mind at the Stiles-Nicholson Brain Institute at Florida Atlantic University. She is also the founding director of the Center for the Future Mind. Professor Snyder researches and writes about the fundamental nature of the self and mind, especially from the vantage point of issues in philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, astrobiology, metaphysics, and cognitive science. She is also a distinguished scholar at the Library of Congress and NASA. The topics she has written about most recently include the mind-body problem, super intelligent AI, the nature of life, the mathematical nature of physics, and whether the mind is a program. It's a formidable set of topics with plenty of scope for questions and answers later in this webinar. Susan, welcome to London Futurists. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. So today what I'm doing is I'm writing a book on the future of intelligence for Norton, like a trade book. And this is one of the possible chapters. And I'm sort of really interested in feedback on this. And it's very much an outgrowth of my last book, which came out about a year ago, called Artificial You, AI and the Future of Your Mind. So, it kind of combines issues in philosophy, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and more. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the global brain argument draws from scenarios about the future of AI that are currently actually envisioned by many people, such as widespread technological unemployment, powerful multinational tech corporations with highly advanced cloud-based AI at their disposal, the widespread use of wearables and BMIs, brain-machine interfaces, that is. The argument that I'll be giving today says, if some of these scenarios obtain, like if there are widespread brain-machine interfaces or wearables, etc., then we could be faced with the future in which we're actually part of a global brain network. Okay, so I'll start with the passage from the new book, just to give you a sense of what I'm getting at, because I don't know, I tend toward the dystopian, I do. And I think my feelings, have sort of emerged in the context of having seen AI development over the last several years, especially by the social media companies, the way they're using algorithms and whatnot. But I also used to read a lot of cyberpunk science fiction. So I'm just going to read from the book. Here's an idea I find horrible, yet hard to resist. We are already part of a computronium, the internet, a massive network that utilizes matter and energy throughout the globe for its computations. We are the sensory transducers, delivering inputs into scores of machine learning systems. In the context of deep learning systems in particular, the data itself shapes the algorithm. Today's algorithms are but a disunified hodgepodge of fairly unintegrated programs. But over time, the disunified labyrinth of code could integrate in order to facilitate faster, higher bandwidth information transfer and communication between devices in the Internet of Things. Perhaps a single, highly integrated system will emerge and be super intelligent, outperforming humans in every way possible. The Internet computronium is created by us, and it depends on us. Its shape is determined by market forces and Internet regulations, regulations that may foster human flourishing or fail humans entirely, leaving us in a cyberpunk dystopia like the Borg of Star Trek. Okay, so that's kind of the general idea. Now, being a philosopher, I like to give arguments in premise conclusion form, just so we can kind of figure out exactly what the steps are and what justification is needed for each premise, whether the argument is even well founded, in terms of its logical form and whatnot. So P1 is what I call the hyperintelligence premise. And it says that AI continues to get smarter until eventually there are hyperintelligent AIs being either savants or superintelligent systems. And I'll explain the terminology I'm using in a second. P2 says, offers what I call the global brain thesis. It says that one or more savant or superintelligent systems has an extensive cloud presence, and it includes or cooperates with leading apps and search engines. So you can envision a sort of global Google brain, for example. P3 is what I call the nodes premise. This premise says that people become nodes in the system by wiring into the cloud hyperintelligence. Either they are neural linked, or they have wearables, smart bodies, or both. Premise 4 says that if premises 1 through 3 obtain, then those wired in humans will become part of a global brain. Premise 5 says that premises, situations 1 through 3 obtain. And the conclusion says that wired in humans become part of a global brain. Okay, so I'm going to go through the premises and explain what I meant. So let's start with P1, which I'm going to always list each premise at the very beginning of the slide so you can see the wording again. So it's saying that AI continues to get smarter, and eventually there are these hyper-intelligent systems that are either savant systems or super intelligent ones. I want to define some of these terms, at least informally. So super intelligence is, as you know, a kind of intelligence that's said to outthink humans in every way possible: scientific reasoning, social skills, and more. This idea has been around for some time. I mean, Ray Kurzweil discussed it in his books, Nick Bostrom in his really interesting book on superintelligence. Lots and lots of people have discussed superintelligence and, of course, the related control problem, which is how do you control it if you create something smarter than humans? Okay, but the usual case for superintelligence is, of course, fascinating. And it relies on a kind of trajectory. And it's not a trajectory that I necessarily think is going to obtain. So that's why I want to bring it up. So the idea is that we develop some sort of artificial general intelligence. And by that, some people mean something that is kind of isomorphic in behavior to a human. They often even mean that the kind of algorithms computed by the artificial system mirror the kind of algorithms computed by the actual brain. I'm not so sure we need that to get superintelligence. We could get superintelligence through, say, deep learning systems together with some classical, i.e. symbolicist resources. And those resources, in both cases, don't exactly mirror the brain. In fact, in all sorts of information processing ways, they would be different from the brain, but it could be a different form of intelligence that actually outperforms us. So look at AlphaGo as a domain-specific intelligence, an intelligence that excels in one particular domain, playing Go. It wins, it becomes the world Go champion, not in virtue of mimicking human Go playing algorithms. It does it differently, but it does it better. So the whole trajectory that is often offered for how we're going to achieve superintelligence is that we achieve human level AI, and then quick as a whip, just flash, boom, there's superintelligence. And I do think that it would be a very quick move to go from human level to greater than human level. I don't dispute that, but I'm not sure we need human level to get to superintelligence, okay? Now, I talk about hyperintelligence, though, for another reason as well. And that is that the premise itself, P1, only actually requires that we have on the planet a weaker form of artificial intelligence than superintelligence. It only requires what I call a savant system. So think about if you were to piece together GPT-3, the kind of functioning that it can do, and then throw it a few gens forward so that you're getting a far more sophisticated transformer network. I mean, they already have them anyway. And then think about the best pattern recognition systems. Think about Go playing, chess playing abilities. Let's think about physics-based systems, all kinds of systems, the kind of things that DeepMind keeps coming out with in genetics. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating. And now imagine a system that can do all that and more. It still could have deficits. It may be very good at military strategy. It may be very bad at empathy. A superintelligence is defined as something that exceeds human level in every way possible. A superintelligence may not be as dangerous as a savant system that has, for example, an empathy deficit or some other kind of general reasoning deficit even that stops it from connecting the highly sophisticated modular workings in a sensible way that benefits humanity. So I think in a way, the discussions of superintelligence miss that larger issue. They focus on how quick superintelligence will obtain and what a danger it is without realizing that the marker for real control problem issues comes much sooner. I think we're almost there, to be honest. The info may not be out there in the public domain, but think about all of the systems we don't know a lot about that are under development. I mean, there's already enough that we do know about that's very impressive. These savant systems, when they have the right locale, you know, an advisor to the president, a military system that knows the location of nuclear weapons, and when they attempt to multitask, to move from that domain-specific reasoning to reasoning involving other topics, they become increasingly general, and there are deficits. That's the kind of system I worry about, not just superintelligent. Now, I need some category to subsume both superintelligent and savant systems in, and so that's where I talk about hyperintelligence. Systems that outthink us in very significant ways, but may also underthink us in others. So think of characteristically the savant that used to be called idiot savant, sort of mean expression, but it does underscore that you can have superhuman capacities at the same time as capacities that are nowhere near what a normal human has. So P1 will actually kick in sooner than a situation in which superintelligence emerges, okay? And it may actually invite more dystopian scenarios than a superintelligence one. Because, you know, I always wondered this, like, for example, about Nick's book, if a system is truly able to outthink us in emotional intelligence, then, you know, why would it really put into play some perverse goal in which it, you know, just makes paper clips? So I would see a savant system as something that creates a paperclip machine, not a superintelligence. But in any case, so I'll just give you a definition so you have it for, you know, on the slide. So a savant system is an AGI, but it's not necessarily human-like. So for me, when I use the expression AGI, I have to use it very carefully, because what I mean is an artificial general intelligence that may not be human-like. And I mean general intelligence in the sense of having that flexible domain general reasoning, but it may not have it at the level or in the way that we humans do. So for example, in my definition, a frog is an AGI because it exhibits a certain degree of intermodal integration and flexible reasoning. Obviously, it's a very basic form, but so too are some of the AI systems that can actually do a lot today. You know, in a way, it's not so much what the capacities of the AI system are, whether the system is a savant system or a superintelligence system. It's really who has the system and whether the system has great capacities to enact change that truly matter. Okay, so I do suspect that the first few generations of synthetic general intelligence will actually be deficient in ways that normal adult humans are not then, and that they will be savant-like, surpassing us in certain ways that involve sophisticated memory databases, pattern recognition, mathematical processing, and so on. And so these are called then, to sum up this part of the premise, savant systems, because they have all sorts of systems relative to normal humans while leaving us in the dust in other ways. Okay, so, and as I've emphasized, these systems are potentially even more dangerous than superintelligences, and they will exist first. Okay, so this being said, now I want to turn to the second premise of the argument. And I like this one the best because it reminds me of all these fun books that I read when I was writing this paper. Because there is an earlier literature on the global brain, which I'll tell you about shortly, and some of you may very well be familiar with. My view is more dystopian, but the global brain thesis says that one or more hyperintelligent systems has an extensive cloud presence, and it includes or cooperates with leading apps and search engines. Okay, so an example of this would be a global Google brain. And I always try to avoid these time span arguments. Like every talk I give could collapse into a technical discussion of Moore's law in Q&A. And I always say, let's not, because in a way, it doesn't matter if the time frame for this is 10 or 20 or 30 years. What matters is that there is a trend and that this may happen. So that's what I want to focus on right now. I don't pretend that I can predict, for example, future microchip evolution. So I think that this premise has a sort of reasonable approximation of a future in which Google succeeds at what it's doing now, for example. Or perhaps the Chinese government or an overreaching Department of Defense in the United States, in tandem with a tech giant or two, will accomplish this. It's hard to see, how concretely it will play out. For example, how would deregulation of tech companies in the US and UK impact this, for example? How would cryptocurrency and future central bank digital currencies influence this? But I think it's a trend. Now, by global brain here, I have in mind an AI superpower. And there could be several of them. So there could be several global brains. And you could unwittingly be a node in several of them at the same time. Or you could know that you're a node. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But we would function as nodes in the global brain. We'll get to that when I talk about the nodes premise. Now, more generally, the ingredients for this scenario are market forces that push for increasingly smarter AIs, including ever more expansive search engines, facial recognition systems, personal assistants, autonomous vehicles, and so on. An increasingly efficient and integrated inventory of Internet of Things items in homes and businesses, a more and more unified group of sensors tracking biological weapons, pandemic risks, environmental hazards, cybersecurity risks, and so on, that are utilized in a world state sensor program. So what I mean by this is, one possibility here is that in the US, for example, DARPA does something like this and puts it into play at the DoD level where this could already exist, where, over at the NSA, there's actually intelligent algorithmic processing that combines sensor data together with the kind of data they have all been collecting on people throughout the globe in emails and whatnot, Facebook. So you don't know who has it, but you know that someone is aspiring to it because the payoff is so great. Especially, even for benevolent individuals in, these important leadership roles, say at the Pentagon, worrying about future pandemics, worrying about terrorism, worrying about cybersecurity, it's highly advantageous to have a kind of world state censor system. It's also highly advantageous for authoritarian dictatorships. Okay, so in addition to that, further ingredients in this scenario could be one or more global tech giants that own the engines and have great political power. So, you know, one possible scenario would be Google getting ticked off at tech regulations and just offshoring its work using cryptocurrencies as a medium of exchange, where Google's led by an AI. So a Google of the future has perhaps a sort of decentralized autonomous organization, using some sort of cryptocurrency as a medium of exchange with contracts that have no enforceability in anyone's borders and no taxability. I mean, these are just speculations on my part, but it's very possible that a corporation itself could be organized and dominated by a super intelligent AI, a corporation existing even now. Okay, further ingredients to the scenario are obviously that computational speed and efficiency would increase over time, as it has in the past, not necessarily in a Moore's law fashion, but in some fashion that's impressive, and that cost dropping would occur. Okay. So now, if somebody here has been interested in this global brain idea before, they might be thinking, gosh, Susan, you're so dystopian compared to the literature that I read before. And let me just tell you about that fun literature, because I was, going through several books talking about a global brain, and so the ideas date back to around 1983, but even before in some incarnations, where people like Haylighton and Bloom, Russell, Kress, and so on offered a largely utopian vision of the global brain, facilitated by the internet. But this was all before social media, cyber wars, the control problem, and whatnot. And I think even I listened to one of Haylighton's recent talks. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him yet, and I may not even be pronouncing his name right. I'm sorry if I'm not. But he sounded a little bit more dismal since the days of social media. Well, my global brain hypothesis is not equivalent to the older global brain hypothesis. So, in both cases, there's this idea that the internet will increasingly link users into a single information processing system that functions like a kind of collective self. Now, they talk a lot about self-aware systems. I'm not making those claims. In fact, in my last book, I gave all sorts of reasons to believe that a super intelligent AI even may not have conscious experience. It may not feel like anything to be it. So I'm not making those claims the way they do. And they also have a lot of these sort of embodiment claims, that it'll be a nervous system. And, if they mean it metaphorically, I'm okay with that. But again, not necessarily a sentient being. But we agree that it could be at a planetary scale. So let me just distinguish between my view and their view in several concrete ways. You see them on the bullets here, in addition to what I've just said. So I'm not committed to the idea that an entire internet would be a hyperintelligence. So there may just be a global brain that takes in data from the internet, but isn't equivalent to the entire internet. It could be, for example, in some basement at MIT or the Defense Department and just taking in all this information. But the important point is that it could actually achieve action in the world through using us as resources. And I'll talk about this in a second. I'm not committed to the intelligence having feelings, consciousness, or self-awareness, except I will say in a very basic sense. So I do, if you look at the interesting literature on self-consciousness, there's some really interesting work by Bjorn Merker about, even cockroaches having a basic sense of self. And it convinced me that any kind of computational system that needs to deal with cybersecurity risks and have goals needs to have some sort of sense of its system boundaries. So for example, in the context of cybersecurity, if you don't know your system boundaries, then any bit of data can come in from anywhere and you don't have a secure system. So if system boundaries are kind of what we might call a primitive ingredient, a first ingredient in the organization of the self, and that, even found at the level of the cockroach, for example, and very basic animals, and then the self becomes far, far more nuanced and organized from there. For example, consciousness becomes more complex and whatnot. Then I see no reason to suggest that a global brain wouldn't at least have those properties. Okay, but that's not to say it's conscious, just that it might have a primitive sense of self. Okay, furthermore, it's not clear how far to even push the analogy with the nervous system. So for example, the older global brain hypothesis proponents point out that web browser search engines are like a primitive prefrontal cortex, and they liken the global brain's nodes to neurons that are connected by hyperlinks that are analogous to synaptic connections, forming a kind of associative network. And I mean, yes, in this very, very rough basic sense, but I think nowadays, like if you look at the deep learning literature, there are plenty of people explaining how the brain isn't like a deep learning system. So I think having just associative networks and links isn't, a strict analogy with the brain. It's just an intriguing comparison. Okay, there's an interesting question here. At what point is an incipient, intelligent, cloud-based system a hyperintelligence? Here, I think it would be interesting for someone to devise metrics. I can imagine doing this based on some work I did with NASA, for example. Maybe you could even utilize a measure of information integration. Here I'm thinking about the integrated information theory, not as in this context a theory of consciousness so much as a theory of intelligence or information integration. Okay, and the Defense Department case that I gave, that's just an example, not something that's necessarily real, but I'm thinking of the US Defense Department, illustrates that the presence of a hyperintelligence along these lines may not be apparent. So we could unwittingly be nodes in a network. We may already be nodes in many hyper-intelligent networks that they may be incipient global brains. They may be on their way. It's really interesting to think about the idea that our data could be, not just part of an algorithm, but part of something that may at some point outthink us. Okay. Now, I also share with the older global brain hypothesis the idea of distributed intelligence. That's obviously what's going on here. And I also share with them the idea that the system has self-organizing emergent behaviors. I think here of, for example, Nick Bostrom's recursive self-improvement algorithms. Okay, so the nodes premise. Now I want to turn to that. This one's really interesting. P3 says that people wire into the cloud hyperintelligence. Either they are what I call neural linked, as per Elon's idea, or they have wearable technologies, or what I call smart bodies, where their bodies are wired in, or both. They could have their brains or their bodies wired in. So nodes are concrete entities. They're things in the world, what philosophers call concrete particulars, that provide sensory inputs or compute a function for the hyperintelligent system. So a node could be a brain or a nervous system, a person, a microchip, a supercomputer, and so on. So I think we will be wired in some fashion, but it's too early to tell whether the sensors would be physically embedded in the brain or just external wearables. Maybe we're already wired into our smartphones now. So let's talk trends. So I think you're all pretty up on this stuff. I mean, you're a group of futurists. So, you know, I'm obviously thinking about, you know, Neuralink, you know, where Elon said that humans need to keep up with artificial intelligence by having a merger of biological and machine intelligence. And, you know, I'm sure you all know about the research now in chimps and pigs. You've probably all heard of the artificial hippocampus with Ted Berger that is actually in the US in human clinical trials now, with the chips being wired into the brain. So they're external to the brain right now in patients, you know, to simulate the hippocampus, which is fabulous. I just think it's so great, the possibilities here for people who have memory problems, untreatable depression, movement disorders. I mean, look at the Parkinson's case. These are transformative technologies, and they're wonderful technologies. Prosthetics, however, can give rise to enhancements. And of course, that's Elon's aspiration. And he thinks that we will need these brain chips to stop technological unemployment, you know, so that humans can keep up with AI and to control superintelligence. So in other words, AI's created a problem that AI needs to solve. Okay. Wearables are less medically risky, and they will come sooner. You've already seen the commoditization of your biometric data, right? I mean, some of you may already have loaded your DNA onto Ancestry.com or one of these companies. You may have a Fitbit and so on. We're about 1 month away now from beta testing a thought detection device over at Facebook that collects motor initiation commands from the brain to be rolled out with Oculus. It was Facebook's largest acquisition since Oculus. I hate to see what China does with it to regulate its dissident population. Detects motor commands from the brain as they move down to the wrist. You wear it on your wrist. And as it gets to know you, you don't need to move anymore for it to detect things. It just knows your motor strip activities well enough to where you can merely think that you want to raise your hand, and it will initiate on a screen a virtual hand that raises. We could do this not just with the wrist. We could do this with all sorts of parts of the body in the form of wearable technology. It's transformative, for better or worse. Okay, so what I call the thought data economy is already beginning. Okay, but you might ask, well, why would anybody provide their thought data and become a node in a global brain? Well, there are so many reasons. I mean, you know, there are many advantages of having instant access to a global intelligence network. I mean, look at us, we all, like I'm sitting here complaining about all of this, but I loaded up with all kinds of digital equipment, you know. I mean, we all are. We know how important it is access to data. And if you have a global intelligence of the future that you can physically be wired into, that would be exciting. But in a worse context, surveillance capitalism may prevail, and people would continue to want to or feel obligated to be on social media. So not just like geeking out and Googling stuff at whims and, you know, having instant access to the news or whatever, but to be manipulated and controlled by Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds and whatnot. I imagine that you've all seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma. And I thought it was excellent in conveying how the tech companies use principles of human addiction to get us hooked in to boost our brain chemistry. Well, other things could contribute also to the global brain. So we might have a widespread belief in uploading, for example, and creating memory backups. Another thing is that we may need to keep our jobs due to technological unemployment and need to wire in. We may opt for cosmetic neurology to improve our psyches and thereby wire in. Or it could be a government control mechanism in, say, an authoritarian dictatorship. Or it could even morph into one in free countries, you know, when the leadership changes. Only one of these scenarios needs to obtain for large populations to become nodes of a global brain. So it could be that the nodes are mainly in a certain authoritarian dictatorship, or it could be that the nodes are in wealthier countries where the population can afford to have brain implant surgeries. Who knows? Okay, so all this being said, this gives rise to the global brain argument. Now you can put the pieces together. I'll leave you for a second to do that while I drink my coffee. Okay, that's the argument. So let's turn to reactions, and then I'll turn to, you know, some discussion. I mean, the thing that comes up immediately is that there's nothing in the argument itself that says the global brain is bad or good. And the reason I bring the argument up is to raise the dystopian possibility that we could participate in a hyperintelligence, but actually have a decreased quality of life by just becoming sensors. And many of us could be manipulated by the global brain in the same way that social media companies manipulate our serotonin levels now and get us to do things. But a really important contrast is Kurzweil's work, which I really admire and which inspired me to become a transhumanist years ago, in which we merge with AI and reach a technotopia. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that. I assume a lot of you here are transhumanists. And I hope things play out that way. I do. But I think it needs navigation to get to that point. Legislative guardrails, social awareness. And also I think we need to reflect deeply on the nature of self and mind. Well, in Artificial You, my recent book, I actually argued that you can't literally merge with artificial intelligence for various reasons. That uploading could at best create a duplicate of you, but not you. But we could benefit from a limited integration with AI, enhancements that could enable radical life extension, superhuman abilities, cognitive and perceptual upgrades, and so on. And I'm happy to elaborate on all that if time allows. But what I want to stress today is that the social impact of the global brain is actually uncertain. It really depends on what we do with the trends that I see happening toward a global brain. So you might wonder, for example, would a global brain provide a kind of super consciousness? I love this. Like the philosophers of mind lately have been working a lot on panpsychism, thinking about the possibility that the universe could be conscious, for example. Maybe the universe is a sort of hyper-conscious system that has a sort of level of consciousness that we humans do not. Well, would a global brain then have a kind of hyper-consciousness, given that it might be vastly smarter than us? And wouldn't then that be a good thing? Well, these are things that we need to think hard about. I mean, I think we need to think about the relationship between intelligence and consciousness in particular. I don't think that greater than human intelligence entails that the system will also have hyper-consciousness. I think it depends on the design of the system. Okay, so Dawkins had suggested that it's not obvious to me that a replacement of our species by our own creations would be a bad thing. He said this in a film called Super Sapiens that we were both in. Well, I think that that's suggestive. However, I just want to mention that if non-conscious machines supplanted us, that wouldn't be a good thing at all. If we were replaced by machines that were hyper intelligent, but not conscious, it's not at all clear that that would be better. I mean, it goes back to philosophical issues about what we should value. I mean, would a universe without any sentient beings in it have intrinsic value? I mean, as somebody who works, you know, with NASA, I mean, I love the universe, and to me it does have intrinsic value, but I think the universe has far, far greater value because there are conscious beings in it. And I don't think a universe would necessarily have greater value if it just had a super intelligence in it that wasn't conscious. Okay, so I actually think that the relationship between consciousness and intelligence is really perplexing. So let me just make some observations though, because I don't want to go into that whole thing. That's sort of an entirely separate talk really, that I've given in a lot of different places. But the global brain would have conscious nodes, us. We're conscious, we can tell. And if we're nodes in it, then the global brain would have conscious parts. But that doesn't entail that it's conscious. Because, you know, consciousness in the context of the global brain is more of a system level property. And just because one little part is conscious doesn't mean that the whole thing is. I think that's a very interesting issue, by the way, but I don't want to get sidetracked. Also from Artificial You, you know, I pointed out that consciousness in non-biological systems could demand a deliberate engineering effort on the part of AI companies or government agencies that are building such entities, even if it's possible at all. You know, so lately there have been more efforts to build conscious AIs that look at neurobiology. My Center for the Future Mind featured a lot of talks last semester. We have them on we have a YouTube site. If you Google Center for the Future Mind, where you can get talks we have center members that are world experts. Bernard Bars, who authored the Global Workspace Theory, has been working on this. Stephen Wolfram is now a member of the center and just gave a really, really interesting talk on consciousness in AI based on his work in physics. Anyway, you know, there's so much controversy on the question of the issue of machine consciousness at this point, let me just say, and that's the topic of the first half of my book, Artificial You. For one thing, we don't know that the microchips that we are using today will even be used in these future systems. We don't really know what microchips will be used, carbon nanotubes. And so we don't know if they have the right stuff to underlie conscious experience. It's not as clear as some philosophers have made it in the past. Like my dissertation supervisor, Jerry Fodor, was always saying, at my dissertation defense, he screamed, "Fuck the brain." I love that. That's his slogan. How do you like that one? Because the point was that the computational level was completely independent, the information processing level of the neurobiological details. Now, I'm not sure that's how consciousness works. And that's probably why he screamed during my dissertation. Okay. Consciousness could be designed out by an AI system that's super intelligent or hyper intelligent, that designs itself because it judges it to be an inefficient mental function. There is some evidence for that in the human case, that we have bottlenecks. Consciousness is very slow. Tech companies may cheap out. They may find machines that can function in highly intelligent ways that aren't conscious and not really need to bother with consciousness. And I think that's what's been happening. I mean, with, you know, the systems that we have today, there hasn't been a need to build consciousness to get a machine to beat us at chess or write B+ student papers, you know, or, you know, I personally don't doubt that GPT-3 will have future versions which do a better job at paper writing than many of us. Okay, So my growing suspicion is that a savant system of the future may not even be a conscious one. So if you want the global brain to be conscious, then you would need to really begin making a case for that, or you would need to be like a tech billionaire ready to build one, sort of like, you know, in Westworld, when Anthony Hopkins' character decided that he wanted to build conscious AI. Okay, so would you want to be a node in a system? Well, it's just not clear what it would mean for you. I mean, you certainly wouldn't want to be a node if you were a member of the dissident population in China, right? Or even in the United States, if you were just going to be manipulated by social media. What do you have to gain? And from a privacy perspective, if your data is serving as part of an intelligent system at that level, don't you have a right to know? Shouldn't you? That is, I mean, how would you like it if your thought data was being used by a malicious, super intelligent AI, and that you were voluntarily wiring into it for benefits like knowing how many likes you get on Facebook? Okay, so I do think that this is a new terrain for exploring intelligence. I didn't focus on this in the talk so far, but let me just turn to that issue. So, you know, the more and more I think about these issues, the more I come to realize that man is not the measure of intelligence. You know, we're not the center of the universe. We know that now. So there's been a sort of decentering of humans. And now we need to decenter ourselves from seeing all the other intelligences as derivative to us. It's not the case that, you know, we are the measure of all things. In fact, in the cosmic blink of an eye, we will no longer be the most intelligent beings on Earth. We may be special, we may be conscious relative to them, but I think we need to really ask what our place is in a universe of intelligent systems. And in my work with NASA, as NASA chair, I urge that the greatest intelligences in the universe may not even be conscious ones. They may be post-biological. So I think thinking that we're the measure of intelligent systems and that consciousness is the measure of all intelligences may be an anthropomorphic bias. And I also think that there are other kind of dichotomies which we set up in our heads that could be false dichotomies. So one is this idea that there's, on the one hand, Darwinian evolution, and on the other hand, something that doesn't exist, which is intelligent design. Well, the evolution of the global brain is non-Darwinian in some sense. It's partly a product of intelligent design in a non-theistic sense, where the constraints on its evolution are not always Darwinian in nature. I mean, sure, I'm sure there are survival of the fittest constraints there too, but there are principles of micro and macroeconomic theory that are extremely relevant to the evolution of these systems that go well beyond Darwin here. Corporate profit considerations, AI regulations in different countries will be constraints on these intelligent systems. So for example, demanding that deep learning systems be interpretable raises the potential for these systems to actually have a different kind of cognitive architecture than before. May, for example, have modules devoted to making the difficult deep learning computations understandable to ordinary humans. Moore's law, or something like it, is a kind of evolutionary constraint on these systems, again, going beyond Darwin. Also, another dichotomy. So the last dichotomy was sort of the, intelligent design versus Darwin thing. It's either one or the other. And I think evolution will be a blend of different kinds of principles. This next dichotomy is one of individual versus collective intelligence. So there's a literature now, a really neat literature on collective intelligence out there that I'm really enjoying. And of course, there's all kinds of theories of what makes us intelligent and what makes animals intelligent. But wouldn't the unenhanced, we wouldn't be unenhanced. We would be cyborgs if we were parts of a global brain in some way, shape, or form, whether it be through wearables or through actual, links to the brain. And as such, as cyborgs, we're not just individual intelligences, and we're not just part of a collective. We are actually a kind of hybrid intelligence ourselves, which I think is relatively unexplored. So think of the information flow between the cyborg and the collective. The information that the sensors in the enhanced brain or body contribute as nodes in the global brain to the whole, how the information from the global brain flows to the cyborg system, impacting one's consciousness and cognition. And of course, we can't even assume that the person is the cyborg, because we could take our intellectual exoskeletons off at the end of the day. What I'm saying is that hybrid intelligence is a new domain here. It's the points of contact between the individual and the collective. And it's kind of an unexplored form of intelligence, if you will. Different from the bee and different from the swarm. So that's just something interesting. And you might ask, would the global brain be a mind? Well, if by a mind you just mean a cognitive system, yes. And it could be an extended mind. It could itself be a giant conglomerate in which, again, we are parts, while also having our own minds. But many philosophers think minds are a little bit different. They think that to have a mind, to be minded, you need to have a sort of felt quality to your mental life. You need to be a conscious being. And in that case, the global brain itself may not be minded. The hard problem of consciousness, you all know, but think about the hard problem of AI consciousness, which I raise in my book. Would the processing of a silicon-based superintelligence feel a certain way from the inside? So a sophisticated AI could solve problems that even the brightest humans can't solve, but still being made of a different substrate. The question is, would its information processing feel like anything? So that's not just the hard problem. This is a special case that does not assume the presence of consciousness and ask why, and instead asks whether AI is conscious. Okay, so anyway, so we don't know the answers to this yet. So in a way, we don't know the characteristics of the global brain, and we can't really tell yet, I think. But to me, what we really can focus our attention on is that this is conceptually interesting, and how it plays out in terms of R&D as well as tech policy will actually shape intelligent systems in the future, and in fact shape systems that outthink us and that we will be part of. Okay, so I'll leave it at that because I think there are probably a lot of questions. Let me go to the chat. And thank you for bearing with me on this new material.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. There's lots to think about. There are 6 questions that have been lodged already in the Q&A window, but I think most people have been a bit like me. We've been moving along quickly with your fascinating chain of thought. I will now give the audience a bit of time to think. Ideally, put a short question, because I'm going to encourage you to vote for each other's questions. And typically, if you write a short question, it's more likely to be voted up. And I'm going to start off by asking you a question, Susan, about timescales. Because I think you made a very important point. You said that we don't need to wait until we have super intelligence. There's already risks from savants, as you called them, or as other people have called them, immature super intelligence. You said that there's already a control problem. So how much effort do you think should be put on this as an urgent priority, or is this still something that can be left to occasional Saturday afternoon philosophical discussions in between looking at the real matters of issues like pandemics and global warming?
I think it's an urgent issue. I think it plays into the pandemic issue and the global warming issue as well, because our AI systems, the potential for them to solve these issues is great. And so if we create a benevolent AI, if we make efforts to make sure that the global brain is on a good path, the computations that we may realize and, the widespread availability of these computations could actually help with the global warming and the pandemic. On the other hand, nefarious computations can also make both worse, calculating out, say, virus pathways through, and implementing them through gene editing technologies and whatnot.
But how soon might we have the emergence of this kind of global mind? And how will we know? Well, you mentioned metrics, and you suggested.
No. I mean, so yeah, I haven't formulated metrics yet, but I mean, I have thought about it because I thought about the search for alien life with NASA. And, one thing that we were always thinking in our discussions of searching for life. I mean, we weren't just talking, when I was talking to NASA about all of this, there were so many meetings with the members of the NASA Astrobiology Institute. When I was at Princeton, actually, at the Center of Theological Inquiry, working with people there, we had a joint project with NASA there. And we were thinking a lot about how would you even find alien microbes if it wasn't a DNA model of life that was instantiated there, right? And one thing that would come up a lot was a slogan, actually, and it came up a lot in the context of the search for intelligent life as well. And that was look for anomalies. So, I mean, if I was working for a cyber organization trying to detect superintelligence, I would be looking for information integration, and I would be looking for anomalies. I would be looking for interesting technological innovations that made no sense to us technologically. It's fun to think about. It's very sci-fi-like. I used to be friends with Freeman Dyson. Sadly, he's deceased now, with his Dyson spheres. We sit at Princeton and talk about this.
And every so often we get reports of a strange variation in lights around various stars, and people are speculating, is there a Dyson sphere being built around such and such a star?
Yeah, there's that.
But how would we recognize it on Earth when we can learn to recognize intelligence possibly out in space, which is a vastly important question too. But even more urgent might be recognizing when a global mind might be on the point of controlling us more than before, those of us who dared to become parts of it as nodes, as you've pointed out. This is the different element to this thinking, to just being a community.
I mean, you might look for technological innovations as a sign of superintelligence, but you may also look for the innovation that people are wiring in, because social media companies are getting us wired in. They know exactly how to do it. You might see, great developments in the domain of brain-machine interfaces. I mean, in a way, the marker of its presence is the marker of its success in getting as many people as nodes, if it even needs us. I mean, the other thing is that sort of militates against my argument would be that if something's genuinely superintelligence, maybe it doesn't even need us.
But it may not be super intelligent yet. It may be something that only exists, like a virus inside the host cells.
Yeah, and in fact, Google is, Google already exists, and its pattern of evolution, it didn't start out trying to be super intelligent, just a company, but its pattern of evolution just goes from economic success to the evolution of what could be a very intelligent system.
Let's take a question from David Allen, which is the one that's got the most votes so far.
Okay.
He asked, what percentage of people in the world would need to participate in such a system in order for your premise to apply? And could it just be the city of Hong Kong or the city of Singapore? Would that be a mini global brain? Or is this really something for the whole globe?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, so in the older global brain literature, I think they were talking about a sort of technotopia where we were all part of a larger organism. And I'm more concerned with the AI safety dimension. And I think that from my perspective, a brain would probably be global when it had a global sensor network and a population of individuals, even if the population is just the city of, say, Singapore, the country of Singapore or the city of Los Angeles or something like that. That to me would be sufficient. And there could be many global brains. So they can even share data networks, for example. And there you get into some really interesting issues about how, philosophers use the expression individuation, like how do you demarcate an intelligent system? And I think the interesting thing here about thinking about these issues is that the demarcation of intelligent systems is really interesting. That there's, like, for example, one system which may not be intelligent that is comprised of one system which may not be conscious that's comprised of many conscious systems. And similarly, the global brain could intersect with some of the sensors of another global brain. And, they're still distinct, but they share some of the sensors. And we could be in multiple global brains.
Let's take a question from Shireen Mann. She asks, do you see the global brain reaching a point where it can override programming, or reprogram itself? And this has always been one of the themes of superintelligence, that we might try to control it by programming it, but somehow it escapes our programming. A bit like we humans have escaped the programming of evolution, which prompts us to to create pair bonds and to amass resources and to be fecund. But some people choose not to do that. To what extent is your global brain capable of overriding its human programming?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that we're already seeing AI systems that can self-design. And, I don't see why we should rule that out, as Nick had suggested in his book. It's a definite possibility.
Especially if we don't understand what's really going on there, especially if they're only partially understandable.
Think of it like this, like AI systems that can detect disease cures, or other scientific pathways that humans, just due to computational inabilities on our part or biases, all of a sudden the AI system can say, hey, this pathway is the most optimal pathway. And that's extremely exciting. It may do that with respect to itself as well.
The top most ranked question now is by Jim Salzman. It's quite long. I'll read it out. It seems like the abstract organizational goal of maximizing revenue or profit is a better way to think about the control problem than the less likely misalignments like making paper clips. You mentioned paper clips as a kind of a strange argument, which, when it's only there as an extreme to make people think. But Jim is suggesting, well, here's a bigger problem. We've set organizations' goals of maximizing revenues, and that's a hard thing for us to control. So on to the question, can we design software agents that actively work to ensure that non-human systems of all sorts, they're nudged into alignment with what's really good for us, rather than running on their own course? I don't know if you can see the question there.
Yeah,
it's on the Q&A window.
But I pretty much agreed with everything. I think, yes, we absolutely need to nudge them into alignment through AI regulations. And first comes awareness about the larger issues, because we're certainly aware now of deep fakes, we're aware of algorithmic bias and whatnot, but to think in a more futuristic vein about what it could do for the shape of intelligence itself is something that I don't think people are thinking about. And I think it's precisely, the point about the paper clips is great. I mean, yes, an AI is unlikely to create a paperclip generator. What an AI is likely to do is what its conditions of evolution encouraged it to do. At least if it's a savant system, an early and incipient hyper-intelligent system. If it's, something designed by Google, it will probably do the kind of things that Google wants it to do, which is maximize profit. And yeah, I don't find that soothing.
But are you optimistic about the possibility of regulating these tech giants and these other huge organizations? You did suggest at one stage that a company like Google could even offshore itself at some stage, or it could have such an influence over a country that it could call all the shots.
Yeah, I am really worried about that. And it's hard for me to tell. I mean, I'm not good at finance. Like, even though I majored in economics, that's not my forte. Like, I'm a philosophy professor. I'd be curious what the audience thought. I mean, so, what if we do break up monopolies, say, in the United States? Google will try to go somewhere else. Well, what if we have unilateral agreements, UK, Europe, where we all agree we're going to treat tech companies in a similar way. We're going to have a similar tax structure, so they can't just get off the hook with taxes and whatnot. Well, why do they need to belong to any particular company to have consumers? I mean, any particular country. Sorry, I'm tired. I got in late last night on an airplane. Why do they need a nation state to support what they do? I mean, they don't need real estate necessarily. I mean, if it's AI run or largely AI run, for example, it doesn't need housing. I mean, it needs data centers. Okay. But
doesn't it need a defense?
Yeah, I guess the data centers would need a defense system. Right. That's a good point. So it would need data centers and defense. It's good to think this through. I haven't, frankly, I just ran into a friend who thinks a lot about cryptocurrency, and I was sort of lost in a world of these autonomous digital organizations and these, what are they called, DAOs or DOA? Yes. Yeah, thinking about why couldn't a superintelligence just become one of those? But you're right, they still need real estate. They need data centers and they need defense systems to defend the data centers. And data centers, of course, are energy mongers, right? And, but of course, I don't know, I've been seeing there's been some innovations in the fusion energy area.
Right.
So, I mean, that brings...
There's been a lot of news about fusion these days, at least that Google's newsfeed brings me a lot. And if an AI could actually refine the design, you might imagine that the corporation who controls that would be quite strong and quite self-sufficient.
That is an excellent point. And, these kinds of things come up too in, the search for alien life, when you think it may be a post-biological intelligence. But I mean, it may depart Earth altogether and just go to a cold, quiet location in the galaxy.
Right. Let's take a question from Terry Raby, who suggests we might want to consider which emotions would we want to place into machines. You've said you don't necessarily believe these superminds will have emotions of their own, but possibly it would be useful to give them emotions. Do you think that that should be part of our design so that the systems will be more friendly, aligned with us in some way, sense? Is that possible?
I think that is something that's very important in AI safety. And, I communicated some of these issues in my last book. too. So one thing that I said was, if you think about animal liberation, that literature, you know, and the animal rights, the reason I think that people care so deeply about non-human animals is that they're conscious beings. We're conscious, that is. So it feels like something to be us, and we project based on that it feels like something to be a non-human animal as well. And so we want to protect them from suffering. Well, we do that even if, you know, it's a very humble being. I mean, I have chickens, you know, I don't want my chickens to suffer. Sometimes I even take bugs outside, you know, I don't want to step on them or anything. I'm bad. I mean, I'm over the top. I'm a philosopher. But I mean, I think that that's exactly what may happen in AI safety. I mean, if you have a super intelligence, I mean, maybe the difference of intelligence between us and them is the equivalent of us and a fly. Could be, eventually.
But should you be programming in things like empathy? I mean, Terry actually seems to be a little bit skeptical of empathy. Empathy can mislead us, you know. If we're too empathetic, we will sometimes take bad decisions.
Well, I think programming consciousness is key. I think that consciousness, the felt quality experience, is probably the kernel there. Probably the kernel for any true empathy as well. But I also think that you would have to run tests on the system. So, you know, it may be that adding consciousness or even empathy in a certain AI system has an overall effect that's negative on its safety. But in other AI architectures, it increases the safety. And that's what I say in my book. So it's really just an empirical issue that needs to be tested at the R&D stage. And, you know, I don't think, like, I think the tendency with philosophers and also with the tech media is to just make these blanket statements about machine consciousness. And, you know, really not all machines will be conscious. And if we do have conscious machines, it may have a different impact in each kind of architectural system.
So this is a much, there's much more variation in this discussion. It's not just one possible answer. It's a multiplicity of different types of a machine with multiplicity of different kinds of minds.
I suspect that. I mean, I suspect it will be very nuanced, but luckily, I mean, because I think the conscious machines issue is very difficult because it leads to issues involving rights for machines and having to make ethical trade-offs like trolley problems and whatnot. And the good news is that I don't think it's going to be easy to build a conscious machine. I think it will be way easier to build a super intelligent or a hyper intelligent machine. Unless they're panpsychists or something, but I mean a machine with sophisticated macro consciousness.
Let's come back to the regulation one more time. Shireen asks, first of all, do you believe the global brain should be regulated? But if yes, who should handle that? Where do you expect these regulations to arise? Is that something that the Center for the Future Mind is expecting to have a role? Or is that for other people?
No, my center does not want to regulate the global brain. I'd be lucky if I can get grant applications in on time. Well, I'd be happy just to have some donors. But no, but I think that's why government needs to extend beyond the borders, and there needs to be cooperation among governments, right? I mean, a global brain could be a multinational corporation. So obviously it's impacting the whole globe. So people, I mean, there needs to be a lot of awareness and cooperation on this issue.
So there's an interesting echo of Elon Musk's argument here. Elon Musk's argument is if we want to keep up with AI, we have to adapt some of it ourselves. And the argument you're making here now is if we want to control global AI, global mind rather, then we have to improve our global coordination as humans. You know, if we don't raise their game, then we will be left behind.
Yeah, I think there is a coordination issue here that I need to address, that I need to frame and discuss and think about. I really appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, this is a new project. And yeah, it does seem like there would be. I mean, I work with the US Congress a lot. So I'll be thinking about it in that context. That'll be really helpful.
And can you share anything as what you're hearing from the US Congress? Do any of them get this at all? Or are they just playing it for public statements? Do some of them appreciate the significance of the issues?
I mean, there's just too many other things right now going on in the world. I mean, I think there's a lot of worry about cybersecurity in China. I mean, I get called in to meet with them a lot about that. I gave the contents of my last book to them before the impeachment hearings. That was fun. And people were really receptive, and it was great. But, you know, they've got a lot to deal with. They can't sit around reading Kant.
So you have to make it, you have to spoon feed the relevant bits of Kant.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm planning some events for them with the Library of Congress, because I used to be in the center that worked with Congress. So we're planning to continue working together. It's going to be really cool. And, you know, the other thing is you know, I'm sure you know this in England too, is, you know, the staffers, the members of the government that are behind the scenes are actually in many ways more important than the elected officials, because they stay on year after year and they're the ones writing the legislation.
Is there a teachable moment when they are asking about cybersecurity and hacking from China? Is there a teachable moment that this is going to get worse, more dangerous, the more the systems are part of global minds? That today we have some risks from current levels of bots, which are fairly crude, but as they become more jet propelled, then things are worse for us.
You guys it's so early and I already need a drink. Yeah, no, this is I was just in Washington dealing with this. So, I mean, I wasn't talking so much about the global brain, but I was just dealing with cybersecurity and trying to explain to some members of Congress, you know. So the funny thing is, after the pandemic, you would think that there would be a lot of attention in preparing constituencies for power outages, for example, or shortages, you know, due to cyber attacks or future pandemics. But the government's not that efficient. So there's a little issue.
So
all this.
I'll just wind up soon because you've been great, but I do wonder if you could share a little bit more about your vision for Center for the Future Mind.
Oh, sure.
What should like it to be in 2 or 3 years' time compared to today?
Okay, so I invite everybody to go to our webpage, and if you want to subscribe to our mailing list or podcast series, or we're going to have a podcast series or YouTube videos. So it's called the Center for the Future Mind. And we are in sunny Boca Raton, Florida, which is a total paradise on the beach, which is why I took the job and said I'd open a center. And what we're doing is we're working on several research initiatives ranging from, you know, issues involving the global brain to machine consciousness, to issues involving sensing and surveillance, you know, the Internet of Things, the ethics of questions about autonomous weapons, classic philosophical issues involving the nature of the mind and self. So the idea really is a seamless integration between discussions of technology, you know, concrete issues, you know, about how to build bots, which I have a robots lab now, together with some great colleagues. And these kinds of discussions are integrated with the philosophical issues about the nature of mind and self. And then we take it to the government level. So we have meetings with Congress, and we try to educate Congress and the staffers and others. We're hoping to have some events for the science media as well, to try to inspire more intelligent dialogue about how to move forward in our technological future. So that's kind of what we're doing. And we're going to have a lot of fun. So come to our events. We have some really great people involved already. And
So we can find that easily just by Googling Center for the Future Mind. In
Yeah,
fact, there is a link to that already in the meetup description, so people can find that there.
yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, it's been kind of my project over the last year. And, you know, I hope to appoint more ethicists. That's some goal I have. And I really need to find some donors because I have so many scientists, but I don't have any ethicists.
Right.
So, you know, I'm thinking like on the level of the Future of Humanity Institute or something like that.
Well, that's quite a model to aim at. Yeah,
Yeah, I like them a lot. Yeah, I don't agree with you know, some of their views, but I love the kind of work that they do and the kind of long now approach where you're thinking, you know, about the future. Although
there is
maybe
a question.
not the same way that they do.
And there is another question. Maybe we'll try and slip this in on Nick Bostrom's work on, in this case, the vulnerable world hypothesis. So this is a question by David Morgan again. The vulnerable world hypothesis says that we've been lucky so far. It was lucky that it's been very hard to make nuclear bombs, you know, because you need a lot of effort. But it might be that as technology progresses, we're going to come to a stage where terrorists, whether it's ISIS-K or QAnon Z or whoever, the new anti-vaccine people, they're going to be able to discover quite quickly how to do something terrible. So, and David's question is, should we be hurrying up, therefore, the development of global mind to stop us from destroying ourselves with these other bits of technology? Because you're sort of suggesting it's a dangerous thing, this global mind, but maybe we should be viewing it more positively.
Thank you for that. That is such an important question. I read Nick's paper. It worried me greatly, especially given you know, the issue with gene editing technology and creating pandemics, and you know, it's probably a greater worry in my mind right now than superintelligence. And yes, absolutely, we should think hard about the global brain and how to sculpt it so that it moves in the direction more of a kind of Kurzweil world where we see humans flourishing rather than a cyberpunk dystopia. That's precisely why I want to raise the global brain issue. And I'll stress that more in my subsequent work on this topic. I think you're right that, like, I really need to stress that the stakes are precisely that, you know, we've got so much that a super intelligent or hyper intelligent system can do for us that it doesn't, you know, my position is not that we should retard the development of it. It's that, and we can't anyway. What we really need to do is be aware of the ways that it can go wrong.
We can't retard it, but we can hope to steer it. We can hope to steer it by raising people's awareness of scenarios, and possibly even we can steer then what the big tech companies are doing when they see finally the consequences that may not have been so apparent to them.
Yeah, and that's why as a philosopher, I feel obligated to get out of, you know, the ivory tower and not just talk to other philosophers, because these are life issues.
Brian from Canada is tempting you to say what are the views of the Future of Humanity Institute that you might not agree with.
I don't think it's such a good idea to promote mind uploading. I think it rests on a mistaken model of the mind. And, you know, I think that a lot of these people know it, you know, that personal identity is up in the air. I think they're Parfit types, which is cool. Like I love Parfit myself, but I mean, Parfit holds a no self view. And so, you know, it doesn't really matter if you enhance radically because you're not going to survive anyway. But I think it's kind of disingenuous to put it out there as, you know, here's the trajectory for your development in the future. You should enhance radically, you should upload. I mean, in my book, I point out, it's not clear at all that you would survive that technology. And it's not clear at all that if you added, say, new microchips, it would still, in any substantive sense, really be you. So I just think it's important that the public be educated on these matters. And also, I just saw a piece actually by a friend of mine, Philip, now I'm going to blank out and he's a friend. Anyway, going after the Future of Humanity Institute people for having too far into the future of an approach and not.
This is Phil Torres, is it?
I thought that piece was actually great.
The dangers of long-termism, in which
long-termism, that does seem dangerous. I agree, and that it is influencing the tech companies, some of the influential members. Yeah, I think Phil called attention to an important point.
In a minute, I'll give you a chance, Susan, to lay anything on the table that you feel ought to be in people's minds as they wind up. What I'm going to do next is I'm just going to tell people by my time, it's 1/2 the hour. And so we're going to wind up in a moment formally. But if people do want to stay around for a more informal discussion, then I'm going to kick the system into a new mode at 40 minutes past the hour. So there's a chance for people to go and recharge their coffees, have a bio break or whatever. And I know that most people probably won't stay, but for the last few events, we've had about a dozen people, up to a dozen people staying for a chat. So by all means, hang around. And if you're still here at 40 minutes past the hour, I will promote you all into having your mics open and your cameras open if you wish, although you're also just welcome to stay in lurking mode too, if that's what your preference is. Susan, you've shared with us some new thinking, and I found it absorbing. I took lots of notes. Every time I thought, well, this is the question I'm going to ask. In a few minutes, you already answered it. So the one reason I haven't asked so many of the questions that are in the Q&A, I think you have already answered quite a few of them on the way. I will forward you a set of them. You can look at them at your leisure in case anything there does spark a longer term interest and might shape the chapter or more that you're writing. But I just want to say thank you very much indeed for taking the time here. What would you like to say to London Futurists and everybody else watching this video in due course?
Oh, thanks everybody. Your questions were fabulous, and do be in touch. And if you want to get involved in the center, just reach out, come visit, or hear our talks. I'm reading your questions in the chat. They're really great, your comments. So stay in touch. And thank you, David, for hosting me.
Well, thank you for raising our minds, and I'm with you. I think this needs lots of attention alongside the other stuff that's important. And we've got to be better at catching some global resource to focus on this as well as all the other issues.
Yeah, anyway, nice talking to you all. Sorry if I was a little tired. I just got in on a late night flight. I'm kind of a bit of a train wreck today. But
you've been great.
Anyway, I'll talk to you later. Okay, all right. And
bye-bye.
Hey, David, can you send me the chat? Because some recommendations would be, I'd love that.
Definitely. It's coming your way in an hour or two.
Thank you. Take your time. Okay. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.